The courtroom was filled with the usual hum of nervous energy, the soft shuffle of papers, the faint rustle of clothing as people shifted in their seats, and the ever-present tension that filled Judge Judy's courtroom before every case. But today, something was different. Something in the air told the audience that this wouldn't be just another mundane dispute. As the doors opened, Jared Williams strutted in, his presence almost commanding the entire room's attention. He was dressed in a tailored black suit that screamed wealth and arrogance, his expensive watch gleaming under the courtroom lights. But it wasn't just his appearance that turned heads, it was the way he walked. Confident. Smug. Entitled. The son of a sitting mayor, Jared had lived a life most could only dream of. Every door was open for him, every opportunity handed to him on a silver platter. He had never known what it was like to struggle, to fight for what you believed in, or to work for something you wanted. No, Jared had spent his life using his father's political power to manipulate the world around him. It was clear from the way he looked at the people around him, like they were beneath him, insignificant. As he reached the defendant's table, he did something that made the entire courtroom go silent. He waved his father's mayoral badge casually in the air, as if it were a weapon, a shield, or some sort of symbol that made him untouchable. His smile, self-assured and condescending, widened as he saw the courtroom shift uncomfortably under his gaze. To him, this was just another inconvenience, another opportunity to use his father's name and position to get out of trouble. But what Jared didn't realize, as he smugly placed the badge on the table, was that this time, he was not going to get away with it. This time, the rules would be different. This time, Judge Judy was in charge. Judge Judy sat in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she observed the man in front of her. She had seen many like him before, people who thought their wealth, power, or connections could shield them from the consequences of their actions. But Judge Judy didn't care who you were. She didn't care about your badge, your name, or your family. In her courtroom, the only thing that mattered was justice. And Jared Williams had made a grave mistake, one that would cost him more than he could ever imagine. As Jared looked around the room, it was clear that he expected the usual reverence. He had walked into the courtroom with an air of entitlement, thinking that his father's influence would somehow control the proceedings. But Judge Judy was not a woman who could be intimidated by a badge or a last name. Her experience in the courtroom, her sharp mind, and her unwavering commitment to justice made her impervious to the tactics Jared had come to rely on. She had seen the games people played, the ways they tried to manipulate the system. And she was about to teach Jared a lesson he would never forget. The case before them seemed simple at first, a car dealership claiming that Jared had tried to extort money by falsifying damage to a vehicle. On the surface, it was a clear-cut fraud case. But as Judge Judy listened to the opening statements, she knew there was more to this than met the eye. Jared's demeanor told her everything she needed to know. He was confident, cocky, and completely convinced that he could manipulate the outcome of this trial. The arrogance in his voice was almost palpable as he leaned forward, preparing to make his case. "I'm sure you're aware of who I am, Your Honor," Jared began, his voice dripping with entitlement. "My father is the mayor, and I don't think you fully understand the implications of this case. You might not realize the political fallout that could occur if this doesn't go my way. I suggest you consider that before making any decisions." His words hung in the air, a thinly veiled threat masked as an innocent statement. But it wasn't just the words he spoke that caught Judge Judy's attention, it was his body language. The casual way he spoke, the arrogant smirk on his face, the way he waved his father's badge as if it were the key to his freedom. Jared was used to getting what he wanted, and he was convinced that this case would be no different. The audience in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension rising. They had seen many cases before, but none quite like this. No one had ever dared to walk into Judge Judy's courtroom and act with such blatant disrespect. No one had ever thought they could get away with waving their family's badge as if it meant more than the law. And in that moment, Judge Judy's steely eyes fixed on Jared, and everyone in the courtroom knew that this was going to be a showdown. "Mr. Williams," Judge Judy began, her voice calm but firm, I don't care who you are or what connections you think you have. In my courtroom, the only thing that matters is the truth. And right now, all I see is a man who thinks he's above the law. You've made a big mistake by walking in here with that attitude." The weight of her words hung in the air, and the audience could feel the shift in the room. The once smug expression on Jared's face faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. He was not used to being spoken to like this, not used to anyone challenging his authority or his privilege. "I don't know what you're implying, Your Honor," Jared replied, trying to maintain his composure. But his voice betrayed him. There was a hint of uncertainty, a crack in the armor he had so carefully constructed over the years. "I'm just here to settle this matter fairly. I don't think this needs to be blown out of proportion." But Judge Judy wasn't buying it. She had heard enough. The case was not just about the car dealership, and it wasn't just about Jared's fraudulent claim. It was about something far bigger. This was about a man who had spent his life using his father's badge to intimidate others, to make them bow down to his will. And Judge Judy was about to put an end to it. "Let me make one thing clear, Mr. Williams," she said, her voice hardening. "I don't care if you're the mayor's son. You don't get to walk into my courtroom and act like the rules don't apply to you. This isn't a game, and this isn't a place for your arrogance. You've crossed the line, and now you're going to face the consequences." Jared's face turned pale as the weight of her words hit him. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't in control anymore. This wasn't going to be as easy as he had hoped. Judge Judy was no ordinary judge. She was a force to be reckoned with. And he had just made the mistake of underestimating her. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. The sharp, unwavering gaze of Judge Judy pierced through Jared Williams, and for the first time in his life, he felt the full weight of the legal system bear down on him. He wasn't a rich kid being given special treatment. He wasn't someone who could rely on his father's influence to solve his problems. In Judge Judy's court, it was all about the law, and right now, Jared was realizing just how out of his depth he truly was. But Jared wasn't about to back down. He had never been one to take a step back, especially not in front of an audience. His mind raced for a way to turn the tables, to regain control of the situation. After all, this wasn't just any courtroom, this was Judge Judy's courtroom. The entire world was watching, and Jared had spent his life making sure that the world saw him as someone to be feared, respected, even admired. He wasn't about to let some TV judge take that away from him. Taking a deep breath, Jared leaned forward, trying to project an air of confidence that, in reality, was rapidly slipping away. "Your Honor, I think you're misunderstanding the situation here," he said, his voice dropping into a tone of condescension. "I'm not just anyone. My family has worked hard to build the relationships and trust we have with the community. I'm a public figure, and the last thing I need is to have my reputation damaged by a frivolous case like this." He waved his father's mayoral badge once again, a move that was meant to intimidate. But to his surprise, the room didn't react as he had expected. There was no silent awe, no hushed whispers of respect. Judge Judy remained unshaken, her expression cold and calculating. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. In fact, she almost seemed to relish the opportunity to call out Jared for his arrogance. "Mr. Williams, you seem to think that because of who your father is, you are immune to the law. That badge doesn't mean a thing in here. You are not above the rules, and I will not tolerate anyone coming into my courtroom and threatening me or my proceedings." Her voice was sharp, each word cutting through the silence like a blade. The power in her words was undeniable. She wasn't just defending her authority, she was sending a message. She had been dealing with arrogant people like Jared for years, and she had zero tolerance for them. This case would be no different. Jared's expression flickered for a brief moment, a shadow of doubt creeping into his eyes. He wasn't used to being confronted like this. Everyone had always deferred to him, but Judge Judy wasn't everyone. He quickly tried to regain his composure, adjusting his posture and offering a half-hearted chuckle. You're making a big mistake here, Judge. I didn't come here to make trouble. I'm just asking for a little fairness. I'm sure you don't want to go down the path of creating a scandal over something so trivial." He let the words hang in the air, hoping to plant a seed of fear in the judge's mind. After all, no one wanted to deal with the public backlash that came with embarrassing the son of a prominent political figure. Judge Judy wasn't buying it. Her eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, her voice low and unwavering. "Mr. Williams, let me make myself clear. You can wave that badge all you want, but it will not protect you here. The law is the law, and no one is above it, especially not you. So if you think for 1 second that you can manipulate your way out of this, you're sadly mistaken." The courtroom was absolutely still. The audience could feel the weight of the exchange, the tension thickening in the air. The producer's team was silent behind the cameras, their eyes glued to the screen as Judge Judy took control of the room. They knew this was no ordinary case. This wasn't just a small claims case about a damaged vehicle, this was about principle. It was about showing that no one, not even a politician's son, could manipulate the system and get away with it. Jared's smile faltered, but only for a moment. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. He had spent his entire life manipulating situations to his advantage. He was a master of controlling narratives, of turning any conversation into a game he knew he could win. But Judge Judy wasn't playing by those rules. She was playing a completely different game, one that Jared had never encountered before. "Your Honor," he began again, his voice tinged with frustration now, "I'm just trying to get this over with. I'm not here to make waves. But you've got to understand, my father is well connected, and if you make this public, it could cause serious problems. I suggest you think about the consequences before you do anything rash." The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud, and for a moment, it seemed like it might just work. But then, Judge Judy did something that completely shattered his confidence. She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in front of her. "Mr. Williams, I don't make decisions based on threats or intimidation. You can't scare me with your connections or your family name. I've been doing this for longer than you've been alive, and I've seen all the tricks. What you're doing now is exactly the kind of thing that doesn't work in my courtroom. You can threaten me, you can wave your little badge around, but it won't change the facts." Her tone was quiet, but there was no mistaking the authority behind her words. "And right now, the fact is simple, you've committed fraud." Jared's expression changed in an instant, his arrogance replaced with confusion. "What? Fraud?" he stammered. "That's not true. I'm not the one who did anything wrong here." He was losing control of the situation, his carefully crafted confidence crumbling before his eyes. But Judge Judy wasn't letting him off the hook. She continued without missing a beat. "That's right, Mr. Williams," she said, her voice cutting through his objections like a hot knife through butter. "You are the one who tried to extort money from a small business with a fabricated claim. You are the one who thought you could intimidate your way out of this. And now, you're going to face the consequences." The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't just Jared who was stunned, the entire courtroom had gone quiet. No one had ever seen Judge Judy this determined, this cold in her approach. And the people watching at home? They were on the edge of their seats, waiting for the next explosive moment. This wasn't just another case. This was the beginning of something big, and it was only going to get more intense from here. Jared Williams stood frozen in his spot, the full weight of Judge Judy's words crashing down on him. For the first time, he wasn't sure what to do. The arrogance that had served him so well throughout his life seemed to evaporate in the face of Judge Judy's relentless resolve. He had thought that by using his father's badge, he could overpower her, that somehow the political ties and privilege he carried would shield him from accountability. But here, in Judge Judy's courtroom, none of that mattered. The air in the courtroom had shifted. It was no longer just a case, it had become something far more significant. Jared's facade of confidence was beginning to crumble, piece by piece, as he tried desperately to regain control of the situation. But the more he spoke, the worse it got. "I don't know what you think you know, Judge, but I'm telling you, there's been a mistake," Jared said, his voice now shaking slightly as he tried to salvage what was left of his pride. "My father and we've always been on the right side of the law. This is just a misunderstanding. There's no fraud here. I'm not the one who's lying." Judge Judy didn't flinch. She had seen this before, the deflection, the pleading, the desperation. Jared Williams thought he could talk his way out of this. But there was no talking his way out of something this big. The evidence was already stacked against him. It wasn't just his arrogance anymore, it was his calculated manipulation of the legal system, his attempt to use his father's political clout to bully a small business owner. Judge Judy, never one to back down, leaned forward, her steely gaze never leaving Jared's face. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Williams. There has been a mistake, but it's not the one you think. The mistake was believing that the rules don't apply to you just because your father's a mayor. You don't intimidate me. You don't get to make threats and manipulate the truth in here." Jared's jaw clenched, his eyes flickering with rage as his attempt to maintain composure began to slip. "I'm not manipulating anything," he spat, his voice rising. "I have every right to stand up for myself. You're just angry because I'm not taking your nonsense seriously." The courtroom buzzed with energy. People could feel the tension mounting. They were watching as Jared's world began to unravel, and the respect he had always commanded started slipping through his fingers. But none of it was more apparent than in the cold, unyielding gaze of Judge Judy. She was used to dealing with the likes of him, people who thought their money, power, or status could shield them from consequences. Jared Williams was no different. And she wasn't about to let him get away with it. "Anger has nothing to do with this," Judge Judy replied, her voice calm, controlled, but sharp as a scalpel. "What I'm seeing is a man who is used to getting what he wants by throwing his weight around, believing that he's above the law. But here, in my courtroom, everyone is equal. And you will be held accountable for your actions, just like anyone else." Jared's frustration grew as he shot back, "I'm not going to sit here and let you lecture me. I didn't do anything wrong. I was simply asking for fairness. I didn't expect to be treated like this." His outburst was met with a collective silence, the audience sensing the impending collapse of his defense. Judge Judy didn't react to his outburst. Instead, she sat back in her chair, folding her arms with the practiced ease of someone who knew how to handle difficult people. "Mr. Williams, let's get one thing straight," she said, her voice still calm but unwavering. "The law doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care about your daddy's badge. What matters is the truth. And the truth is that you tried to manipulate the system. You used your father's name, you tried to strong-arm a small business owner into a settlement, and now you're trying to use my courtroom as your personal stage." Jared's eyes flickered with fear for a moment, the gravity of the situation beginning to sink in. His usual tactics of manipulation and intimidation weren't working. His father's political influence wasn't enough to protect him here. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, he had underestimated the judge, and now he was paying the price. "Don't sit there and tell me you didn't know what you were doing," Judge Judy continued, her voice gaining momentum. "You've been living your whole life thinking you could do whatever you wanted. But that stops now. This isn't some corporate boardroom where you can buy your way out of trouble. This is my courtroom, and I will not tolerate your disrespect." Jared opened his mouth to speak again, but Judge Judy raised a hand, cutting him off. "We've heard enough from you, Mr. Williams. You've had your chance to explain yourself. Now it's time for me to explain to you what the consequences are going to be." The silence in the courtroom was deafening as Judge Judy stood, her gavel poised above the podium. She had the room's full attention, and the weight of her authority was palpable. Jared's eyes widened in realization. This was it. There would be no more room for his manipulation, no more chances to escape the consequences of his actions. This wasn't just about a lawsuit or a courtroom drama, this was his reckoning. Judge Judy brought the gavel down with a sharp crack, and the words that followed would reverberate through Jared's mind for the rest of his life. "You've committed fraud, Mr. Williams. And now, you'll pay for it." Jared's world tilted on its axis. This wasn't how he had imagined this day would go. This wasn't supposed to happen to him. His father's influence, his wealth, his arrogance, all of it had failed him when he needed it most. But the lesson was clear. No one, not even the son of a mayor, could escape the law when they crossed the line. And as Judge Judy's words settled in, Jared realized the extent of his mistake. The courtroom erupted into whispers. The producers' team stood frozen, their cameras capturing every second of the unfolding drama. But the true impact of Judge Judy's ruling would be felt long after the cameras stopped rolling. This wasn't just another case. It was a lesson, for Jared Williams and for anyone else who believed that power and privilege could protect them from the consequences of their actions. The courtroom had already felt the electric shift when Judge Judy delivered her crushing verdict. But what came next, the fallout from her unrelenting decision, would unfold in the most spectacular and public way. The once confident son of the mayor, who had entered the room with all the swagger of someone who was untouchable, now stood before the court, his entire world in freefall. He had not just lost a case, he had lost everything. Jared Williams tried to hold himself together, but the facade he'd carefully constructed for years had finally cracked. His eyes darted around the courtroom, seeking a lifeline, a way out. But there was none. His father's name, his family's wealth, and his privilege couldn't protect him here. There was no escaping the judgment of a woman who had seen through his manipulation from the start. He was alone. The courtroom was still, almost too quiet. The air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone in the room was waiting for Jared to respond, to say something that would show he understood the magnitude of what had just happened. But he didn't. Instead, he stood there, motionless, his face draining of color. The arrogance that had once radiated from him like a shield was now replaced by the cold, paralyzing grip of fear. He didn't know what to do next. His lawyer, standing by his side, offered him a fleeting look of concern, but there was no comfort in that. This wasn't a case of legal strategy or negotiation. This was about consequences. Real, unflinching consequences. Jared turned his gaze towards Judge Judy, his lips parting as if to say something, but the words didn't come. He couldn't speak. All the self-assuredness he had walked into that courtroom with seemed to evaporate into nothingness. In that moment, he was no longer the son of a mayor, he was just another man facing the consequences of his actions. Judge Judy sat there, unwavering, her eyes locked onto him. Her gaze never wavered. She had seen this reaction before, the shock, the disbelief, the dawning realization that someone who had been used to getting their way was now facing the full weight of justice. She wasn't interested in his excuses. She wasn't interested in any more words from him. She had already spoken, and the matter was settled. "Mr. Williams," she began, her voice once again cutting through the silence. "You thought you could hide behind your father's badge, behind your name, behind your wealth. You thought you could use those things to manipulate the system. But you've learned the hard way today that the law doesn't care about your last name. It doesn't care about how much money you have or who your father is. The law only cares about one thing, the truth." Jared flinched as the words hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. The truth. He had been so wrapped up in the idea of his own superiority, so consumed by his entitlement, that he hadn't even considered what the truth looked like until it was too late. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. There was no defense, no justification that could save him now. The facts were clear. His actions had been deliberate. His manipulation, calculated. His arrogance, misplaced. He had tried to use his father's position to intimidate a business owner, to force a settlement that wasn't rightfully his. And now, he was facing the fallout. Judge Judy's words were sharp, and they were final. "I've seen a lot of people come into my courtroom with a sense of entitlement, Mr. Williams. But you take the cake. You thought you could waltz in here and use your father's name like a shield. You thought the system was your playground. Well, you've just learned that it's not. And now you will pay the price. Jared's mind raced. He couldn't believe it. He had always been able to talk his way out of anything before. He had always been able to charm his way into getting what he wanted. But not this time. This time, the law was not on his side. This time, Judge Judy wasn't buying his excuses. As the gavel struck down, signaling the end of the case, Jared felt a pang of panic. It was over. He had lost. And not just the case, he had lost everything. The grip of his father's power had slipped through his fingers, and he was left standing there, with no one to turn to. The realization was painful, like a physical blow to his chest. The room seemed to close in on him. The weight of Judge Judy's words hung in the air like a thick fog. He was no longer the untouchable son of the mayor. He was a man facing the consequences of his own actions, a man who had miscalculated his power and privilege. He had thought he was invincible. Now, he was about to learn the true meaning of accountability. Jared's lawyer leaned in, whispering something, but Jared couldn't hear it. His thoughts were consumed with the overwhelming feeling of defeat. The courtroom, which had once felt like a stage for him to play out his dominance, now felt like a prison. Every face, every eye in the room seemed to be watching him. His reputation, his status, it all seemed irrelevant now. He had been the predator, the one who thought he could manipulate the system for his own gain. But in the end, he had been exposed as a fraud. Judge Judy had seen through his facade and had held him accountable for his actions. The cold, unrelenting truth had come crashing down on him, and there was no escaping it. "Get him out of my courtroom," Judge Judy said with finality, turning her gaze away from him as she motioned for the bailiff to escort him out. "This is over." Jared didn't fight it. There was no point. His world had just come crashing down, and there was no escaping the consequences now. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, the weight of his defeat settled over him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. This was it. The life he had known, the life built on arrogance and manipulation, was over. And the world would soon know exactly why. The aftermath of the trial had spread like wildfire. Jared Williams' life, once cushioned by privilege and protected by his father's influence, was now being picked apart piece by piece. The fallout from the courtroom would not just be contained within the walls of Judge Judy's domain, it would reverberate throughout the city, and then, much to Jared's horror, it would ripple out into the internet, an unforgiving, never-forget realm. What had been a single moment of arrogance had led to a storm of public scrutiny, social media outrage, and legal consequences that no one, not even his father, could shield him from. The viral nature of the case had taken hold immediately. Within minutes of the episode airing, clips of Jared's smug demeanor and the explosive courtroom confrontation were being shared across every social platform imaginable. Twitter exploded with hashtags like #MayorSonExposed, #PrivilegeVersusJustice, and #JudgeJudyTakesDown the Entitled. The footage of Judge Judy's stern response to Jared's actions, the cold, unflinching truth she had delivered, had struck a chord with millions. Jared's name had become synonymous with arrogance and entitlement, not the respectful, polished public persona his father had worked so hard to project. The media outlets picked up the story, running headlines such as, "Mayor's son faces public backlash after Judge Judy destroys his arrogance," and, "From privilege to pariah, how one courtroom meltdown exposed the truth." It was a far cry from the golden boy he had once been, and in the harsh light of public opinion, Jared saw how quickly everything could come crashing down. In the days following the episode, Jared's phone rang non-stop with calls from reporters, former friends, and even his own father, who, though he had once been a figure of power in the city, now seemed powerless against the tidal wave of negative press. His father's attempt to downplay the incident only made things worse. The mayor had been quick to release a statement defending his son, stating that Jared is young and has made mistakes, but his words rang hollow in the face of the evidence that had been laid bare for the world to see. The damage had already been done. Jared, once able to control the narrative with a smile and a few well-placed words, now found himself drowning in a sea of shame. No longer the spoiled, entitled son of a mayor, he was now a figure of ridicule, a cautionary tale for those who believed that money, status, and connections could protect them from the consequences of their actions. His father's name had ceased to shield him, instead, it had become a liability, dragging both their reputations through the mud. The humiliation Jared faced in the courtroom was nothing compared to the public shaming that followed. Every social media platform had become a battleground, and Jared had become the target. Memes of his stunned expression, followed by the infamous moment where Judge Judy called out his arrogance, flooded every corner of the internet. His own friends and acquaintances had turned on him, no longer willing to be associated with the man who had been so publicly dismantled by the force of justice. In an attempt to control the damage, Jared's lawyer recommended he take down his social media accounts. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. His Instagram feed, once filled with pictures of exclusive parties, designer clothes, and VIP events, was now bombarded with thousands of comments from people who had seen him for what he truly was. The people who once envied him, who once idolized his lifestyle, were now the first to publicly denounce him. His phone buzzed non-stop with messages from people he once called friends, most of them now choosing to stay silent, while a few came forward to tell him exactly how they felt. "Good to know you can't hide behind your dad's badge anymore," one text read. "You thought you could manipulate the system, didn't you?" another one said. Jared's reputation was destroyed. The public's eye had scrutinized every move he had ever made. The more they learned about his life, his arrogance, his sense of entitlement, and his unwillingness to play by the rules, the more they despised him. And just as Judge Judy had predicted, there was no escaping the consequences. But the emotional toll on Jared went far beyond the public backlash. As the weeks passed, his internal world began to crumble. The weight of his actions, the lies, the arrogance, the sense of superiority he had cultivated, now felt like an unbearable burden. His father, once a towering figure in his life, now seemed like a distant memory. The connection that Jared had relied on for so long had been severed, and his father's influence could do nothing to save him. Jared withdrew from the world around him, spending most of his time alone in his apartment, avoiding phone calls and messages, unable to face the people who once looked up to him. His mind replayed the courtroom scene over and over, the moment when his facade of confidence and control had shattered under Judge Judy's stern gaze. He couldn't escape the look in her eyes, the piercing truth that had been delivered without hesitation, without mercy. His family, too, began to unravel. The mayor, humiliated by his son's actions, struggled to contain the growing scandal. He had spent years building his political career, carefully managing his image, only to have it tarnished by his son's misdeeds. The mayor's approval ratings plummeted as the public turned on him as well. Every attempt to distance himself from Jared, to paint him as a rebellious son who had acted on his own, only fueled the media's frenzy. It wasn't just Jared's life that had been ruined, it was his father's legacy that had been damaged, too. Meanwhile, Jared's once thriving business empire began to disintegrate. He had owned several properties, invested in a few startups, and been a fixture at high-end social gatherings. But with his name now tainted by scandal, his business ventures quickly fell apart. Investors pulled out, tenants began to leave, and creditors started knocking on his door. The empire he had built on arrogance and privilege was slowly being dismantled, piece by piece. No one wanted to do business with the mayor's son anymore. No one wanted to be associated with a man whose reputation had been permanently stained. Jared was left with nothing but the harsh reality of his own choices. The moment he thought he could manipulate the system, he had been proven wrong. The world didn't care about his father's name, his wealth, or his position. The law, in its most unforgiving form, had made sure of that. But even as everything around him crumbled, a small part of Jared couldn't help but wonder, if he had only listened to Judge Judy, if he had only respected the law, would his life have turned out differently? Would he have avoided the humiliation, the public destruction, the loss of everything he had once held dear? It was too late to turn back now. The damage had been done.
Nobody in that courtroom could have predicted what was about to happen. The cameras had come expecting a routine legal hearing, the kind Judge Judy had presided over 1,000 times before, quick, sharp, and decisive. But when Nancy Pelosi walked in, everything changed. She didn't walk in as a witness or even as an observer. She walked in like a storm wearing a designer suit, her chin high and her smirk sharper than glass. And in the middle of Judy's measured questioning, when the silence was still and the tension was just beginning to hum, Pelosi leaned forward, raised her hand slightly like she was silencing a child, and said it. The 7 words that would ignite a firestorm across the nation. Before we dive into this incredible case, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing where my viewers are around the world. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss more unbelievable cases like this one. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. You're uneducated, Judge, everyone knows it. The words sliced through the courtroom like shrapnel. For a second, even the clock seemed to stop ticking. The bailiff blinked. The audience gasped. And Judge Judy didn't move. Not a flinch. Not a breath. Just that famous icy stare. The one that has frozen attorneys, CEOs, and con artists in their tracks for decades. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty. It was loaded. As if behind her eyes 100 pages of evidence were already stacking themselves into a weapon. Pelosi smirked again, confident she had won the room. She had no idea she had just pulled the pin on her own reputation, because what Pelosi didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that Judy had been waiting, not for this moment exactly, but for someone like Pelosi. Someone arrogant enough to think Judy's decades on the bench meant nothing. Someone bold enough to think Judy's calm meant weakness. Someone foolish enough to think Judy wouldn't fight back. And what Judy was about to do in the next 47 seconds would become one of the most replayed courtroom moments in American history. But in that frozen silence, the audience saw something else, something they would talk about for years. They saw Judy smile, just barely, a faint knowing smile that said she wasn't hurt. She was amused. She wasn't offended. She was preparing. And as that smile flickered across her face, Pelosi's own expression faltered just for a split second. She didn't understand why the room suddenly felt colder, heavier, charged like the air before a lightning strike. But the viewers at home would later say they saw it too. The exact instant Nancy Pelosi realized she had made the most catastrophic mistake of her career, because Judge Judy wasn't about to defend herself. She was about to redefine herself and expose something Pelosi had spent years hiding from the public eye. And when that hidden truth came out, Pelosi would be left speechless. This was no longer just a legal hearing. This was about respect, reputation, and the silent power of a woman the world had underestimated for too long. If you believe respect must be earned and not demanded, comment "Respect Matters" below, and stand with Judge Judy as this unforgettable moment begins. The courtroom did not recover from those words. Not quickly. The air seemed heavier, like it had grown thicker, harder to breathe. Even the reporters who had come expecting an ordinary civil dispute found themselves leaning forward, their pens hovering, their eyes darting between the two women like spectators trapped inside a slow-moving collision. Nancy Pelosi sat back in her chair, her lips pressed into a satisfied line as though she had just finished carving her name into marble. Judge Judy hadn't moved an inch. Not her hands, not her eyes, not the corner of her mouth. But the stillness wasn't weakness. It was pressure. Silent, invisible, crushing pressure building under the surface like a fault line ready to split the earth open. Pelosi thought the silence was surrender. Everyone else felt it was the opposite. The bailiff swallowed hard. He'd worked beside Judge Judy for years, watched her dismantle arrogance in under a minute, and he could feel it. The shift. It was subtle, like the way wind shifts before a storm you can't see yet but you can feel in your bones. Judy slowly adjusted the papers in front of her, perfectly aligning their corners, her eyes still locked on Pelosi. That tiny gesture sent a ripple of unease through the room. It was the kind of composure that didn't come from calmness but from control. Pelosi broke the silence with a laugh that rang too loudly, too hollow. It cracked like glass in a cathedral. "What?" she said, her voice laced with mockery. "No witty comeback? No clever remark? I suppose education does have its limits." The audience stiffened. They knew that tone. They had seen Judy's courtroom transform from casual to catastrophic when someone used that tone. Still, Judy didn't speak. She just tilted her head slightly, studying Pelosi the way a hawk studies a mouse wandering too far from the grass. And then something happened that nobody saw coming. Judy leaned back. Just slightly. Just enough to suggest she wasn't cornered. She was patient. And as she leaned back, a quiet smile ghosted across her lips, so faint it could have been imagined. It wasn't the smile of someone hurt. It was the smile of someone sharpening a blade in their mind, Pelosi's smirk flickered. For the first time, something behind her eyes shifted. Just a flicker of uncertainty. Gone almost as soon as it appeared. But the damage was done. That flicker told the room everything. Nancy Pelosi had thrown her hardest punch and Judge Judy hadn't even blinked. The tension coiled tighter. The silence stopped being awkward and started becoming unbearable. Reporters scribbled furiously now, knowing they were witnessing history in slow motion. The bailiff straightened his posture as if preparing for impact. A woman in the second row clasped her hands together, whispering something that sounded suspiciously like a prayer. The narrative outside that courtroom had already begun. Phones buzzed quietly inside handbags. Tweets were flying out of the building. Clips of Pelosi's insult were already looping, online with captions like "Pelosi calls Judy uneducated," and the insult heard around the nation. People watching the live stream whispered to each other that Judy looked calm, but her calmness was terrifying, because everyone who had watched her for years knew what it meant. Judge Judy was loading her ammunition. Pelosi misread the silence as weakness again. "I suppose some of us," she said lightly, "rise through merit, and others simply rise through noise." Her tone was silk stretched over steel, but it trembled at the edges just enough that only the closest spectators noticed. Judy noticed. Judy's eyes narrowed a fraction, not in anger but in assessment, the way a chess master studies the board seconds before declaring checkmate. And in that microscopic movement, the energy in the room inverted. Pelosi had walked in towering above everyone. Now, somehow, she looked smaller. The audience began to shift their weight, leaning forward without meaning to, caught in Judy's gravitational pull. It wasn't what she said, it was what she hadn't said. The unsaid words hung in the air heavier than any verdict. "You think I'm uneducated. You have no idea what I know about you." That unspoken promise hung there like a sword suspended by a thread. And everyone knew, the moment Judy decided to let it drop, it would not just cut through Pelosi's insult, it would cut through her entire public image. But Judy didn't strike yet. She let the weight grow, the way a thunderhead lets the air tighten before it splits open with lightning. That was Judy's brilliance, and everyone knew it. She never fought from anger. She fought from patience, from precision, from the unshakable certainty that truth would win, and she would be its instrument. Pelosi crossed her legs, fidgeting with her pen now, trying to mask the movement as casual. It wasn't. The smirk that had once looked like triumph now looked like defense, like someone trying to hold together a crumbling mask. Judy finally lowered her eyes to the papers in front of her, scanning them with the slow deliberation of someone who already knew exactly what they contained. It wasn't about evidence, it was about timing, about building a silence so powerful it would make the coming words impossible to forget. No one in the room knew what Judy was about to say, but everyone knew it would be devastating. For a long moment, Judge Judy didn't lift her eyes from the papers. The scratching of pens had stopped. Even the air conditioning sounded too loud. It felt as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for her verdict on an insult rather than a case. Then, without warning, Judy placed her pen gently across the top page, folded her hands, and looked directly at Nancy Pelosi. The temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees. Her voice, when it finally broke the silence, was almost too calm. "Uneducated," she repeated softly, like she was tasting the word, weighing its worth. "That's an interesting accusation. Coming from you." The effect was immediate. A ripple of sound rose from the audience, the kind of collective gasp people can't stop even when they try. Pelosi blinked, her lips parting slightly as though she hadn't expected Judy to respond at all, at least not like this. But Judy didn't give her a chance to speak. Her tone sharpened by a single notch, enough to cut through the stillness like a scalpel. "You see, Congresswoman," Judy continued, "education isn't just a degree you hang on a wall or a title you repeat to yourself until you believe it. Education is the ability to tell truth from performance. It's knowing when power has blinded someone so completely, they can't tell the difference anymore." Pelosi's smirk returned for half a second like a reflex. It was brittle this time, strained at the corners. She crossed her arms, a gesture meant to look confident but landing like a shield. Judy saw it. Everyone saw it. "I've spent 55 years in the law," Judy said evenly. 27 of them behind this bench, hearing more lies, more arrogance, and more self-delusion than you could fit into every speech you've ever given. Her eyes didn't blink. Not once. "And I have never once mistaken arrogance for intellect. Until today." The words hit like a gavel slamming down. The audience flinched at the soundless blow. Pelosi opened her mouth to speak, but Judy's voice rose. Just slightly, just enough to slide over hers without effort. "Do you know what the difference is between being educated and merely powerful, Congresswoman?" Judy asked, leaning forward now. "Educated people use truth to build. The merely powerful use lies to protect themselves from it. You've built fortresses out of lies for decades, and you think they make you untouchable. But they don't. For the first time, Pelosi hesitated. It was barely there. A fractional pause before her lips moved, a flicker in her eyes, but the courtroom caught it. The cameras caught it, and Judy saw it like blood in the water. I don't need to raise my voice, Judy said, almost whispering, because truth does the shouting for me. The room went utterly silent again. It wasn't Judy's volume that stunned them. It was the precision, the clinical way she was peeling back Pelosi's armor one thin layer at a time. It was surgical, merciless. Pelosi tried to laugh. "Oh, please," she said, waving a hand, her tone dripping with condescension. "This is a courtroom, not a stage. Save the dramatics." But her voice cracked on the last word. Judy didn't blink. "No, Congresswoman," she said. "This isn't a stage. But you've treated your entire career like one, haven't you? Every scandal deflected with a smile. Every failure disguised as strategy. Every truth buried under applause." Pelosi's hand froze halfway through adjusting her jacket. She slowly lowered it, realizing too late that every attempt at composure now looked like fear. Judy let the silence stretch for one long, devastating beat. Then she leaned even closer, her voice dropping into something cold, something sharp. "You called me uneducated, but you know what terrifies you more than anything? I don't need to be part of your world to dismantle it. I don't need your approval, and I don't need your permission." The words slammed into the room like a wave. Reporters froze, fingers hovering above their keyboards. The audience didn't move. It was the tone. Quiet, measured, yet radiating the kind of power that doesn't ask to be recognized because it simply is. Pelosi's face had gone still. Not calm. Just still. The way prey goes still when it realizes the predator has stopped circling and started closing in. "You mistook silence for weakness," Judy said. "But silence is just the moment before truth decides to speak. And I promise you, Congresswoman," her eyes narrowed, glinting like steel in sunlight, "truth is about to speak." The room felt like it tilted. A current passed through it, the kind that makes every nerve stand at attention. Judy slowly straightened her back, reclaiming every inch of the bench as though she were rethroning herself, 1 inch at a time. Pelosi's fingers tightened around her pen, the only movement she seemed capable of. Judy didn't take her eyes off her. "You came in here thinking you could tarnish my name in front of this country," she said. "But the only thing that will leave this room tarnished is yours." And with that, Judy sat back in silence. The trap had been set. The audience didn't know it yet, but they had just watched the first crack form in Pelosi's armor. In 47 seconds, that armor would shatter. Judge Judy didn't give Pelosi a warning. She gave her a countdown, and only Judy knew it had already started. She leaned forward, her elbows resting lightly on the bench, and the room instinctively leaned with her. "You want to talk about education?" Judy said softly. "Then let's educate." Her voice sharpened like a blade sliding from its sheath. "In 1965, I graduated from American University. In 1967, I earned my law degree from New York Law School. I passed the bar on my first try. I've served as a family court judge in New York City, presided over more than 20,000 cases, and have been entrusted with the lives of children, the futures of families, and the enforcement of justice longer than you've been in Congress." The words were rapid now, measured, lethal. "And while you were busy giving speeches about values," Judy continued, "I was upholding them, in rooms where nobody clapped, where nobody cheered, and where the only thing louder than the crying children was the silence after the verdict. That's where education lives, Congresswoman. Not on stages, not in sound bites. In duty." Pelosi's smirk was gone. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes darted toward the audience as if searching for someone, anyone, still on her side. No one moved. Judy didn't blink. "And if you want to compare records," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow hit harder than a shout, "I've never had to beg for respect. I've simply earned it, while you've spent decades borrowing it from fear." A stunned hush swept through the courtroom. Pelosi opened her mouth, but nothing came out. And that was when Judy delivered the line that would echo across America. "Power might silence people, Congresswoman, but education teaches them how to speak again." The words detonated. For a full 5 seconds there was nothing. Not a cough, not a breath, not the scratch of a pen. Just silence, raw and absolute, broken only by the sound of Pelosi setting her pen down with trembling fingers. Judge Judy leaned back, reclaiming her throne with the calm of someone who knew she had just rewritten the moment into history. Pelosi stared straight ahead, her face drained of color, her lips pressed together in the thin line of someone who had just realized they would never win the room back. The 47 seconds were over, and Nancy Pelosi, America's seasoned speaker, could not speak. If Judy's words left you stunned too, smash the like button right now to honor this legendary clapback. The silence didn't break, it shattered. It cracked open like glass under pressure, and what spilled out wasn't sound, but disbelief. Reporters who had been scribbling nonstop now sat frozen, their pens motionless above blank lines, as if they were afraid to move too soon and miss the echo of what they'd just heard. The bailiff slowly lowered his gaze almost in reverence. Even the courtroom cameras seemed to hesitate, their red lights steady but their operators wide-eyed as though they were witnessing something they weren't supposed to see. Nancy Pelosi sat perfectly still. Too still. Her posture said defiance, but her face betrayed the truth. That unmistakable glassy stare of someone trying desperately not to blink, not to break, not to crumble. She clutched the edge of the table like a woman who had just realized the ground beneath her wasn't solid anymore. And Judge Judy? She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply turned one page of her notes, slow and deliberate, as if Pelosi had been nothing more than a mild interruption in the flow of her day. That single gesture hit harder than any words could. The audience shifted back, whispers rippling like wind through dry grass. Someone exhaled sharply, as if they had been holding their breath since Judy's first sentence. Another mouthed the word wow without sound. The reporters finally moved again, not writing, just staring, knowing they hadn't just watched an argument. They had watched an erasure, and everyone knew it. The power in the room no longer belonged to Pelosi. It hadn't for a while. It belonged entirely to Judge Judy. Outside the courtroom, the world had already chosen its side. Within minutes, clips of Judy's words flooded every platform, stitched into highlight reels and replayed in stunned silence by anchors who rarely agreed on anything. Comment sections overflowed with a single sentence. She didn't just win. She reminded the world who she is. Even Judy's fiercest critics found themselves pausing mid-argument, forced to admit what Pelosi had just proven the hard way. That Judge Judy's power never came from theatrics or ratings or the stage. It came from something older, deeper, unshakable, a lifetime of refusing to bend to arrogance. Across social media, new hashtags rose like wildfire. Educated with grace and Judge Judy was ready. They weren't just celebrating her word, they were celebrating what she represented. For young law students, it became a rallying cry. For women who had spent years underestimated, it became a victory they felt in their bones. And for millions of viewers who had watched Judy for decades, this moment wasn't about law or politics anymore. It was about seeing the quiet, fierce force they'd always known her to be finally cut through the noise again, and win without ever raising her voice. Pelosi had tried to shrink Judy to an insult. Judy had answered by becoming larger than the insult itself, and that was the difference between power that demands respect and legacy that commands it. Judge Judy closed her folder as if she were sealing a vault. The echo of that soft thud rolled through the room like thunder muffled by velvet, and just like that it was over. No gavel slam, no raised voice, no dramatic exit. Just the quiet reclaiming of dignity from someone who had tried to steal it, and failed. Nancy Pelosi still hadn't moved. She sat staring forward, eyes glassy, as though her mind was trying to rewind what had just happened, searching for a point where she could undo it. There wasn't one. That was the thing about Judy. Once she spoke, the record was permanent. The audience stood slowly, like people rising at the end of a eulogy. No one clapped. They didn't need to. The silence was the applause, deep, reverent, undeniable. Even the reporters rose to their feet, not out of duty, but instinct, as though something ancient inside them recognized the gravity of what they had witnessed. And through it all, Judy remained still. Not triumphant, not proud, just steady, the same way she had been steady through 27 years of public firestorms, through courtroom storms that would have broken lesser figures. Because Judy's power was never about the performance, it was about the permanence. As she stood, the room parted like the Red Sea. Not from fear, but from respect. That rarest kind of respect, the kind that doesn't have to be demanded or explained. It just arrives silent and overwhelming like gravity. Pelosi lowered her gaze, the first movement she had made in minutes. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was everything. The speaker who had walked in like royalty was now leaving like a shadow, quiet and diminished, swallowed by the weight of her own silence. Judy didn't look at her as she passed. That was perhaps the final blow. The unspoken reminder that once Judy has decided you are no longer worth her attention, you no longer exist in her courtroom. And that was what made this moment echo so much louder than the insult that had started it. Pelosi had tried to reduce Judy with words. Judy had erased her with silence. Outside, the courthouse steps overflowed. A crowd had gathered during the hearing, pulled in by whispers that something historic was unfolding inside. Now they stood pressed against the barricades, craning their necks, holding up their phones, desperate to capture even a glimpse of the woman who had just reminded the nation what authority really looks like. The doors opened. And there she was. Judge Judy, small in stature, monumental in presence, walking down the steps without a glance to either side. The crowd didn't cheer. They hushed as if a gust of wind had passed over them, pulling every stray word out of their throats. The silence was louder than shouting, and then, softly at first it began, a single voice said, "Respect." Another joined, "Respect." Soon dozens were murmuring it, then hundreds, the sound swelling like a tide, rising behind her as she walked into the daylight. A low, steady chant carrying her name like an anthem. Respect, respect, respect. Judy didn't turn. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. She just kept walking. Head high, shoulders squared, as though she were carrying something far heavier than her briefcase. Something invisible yet unbreakable. Her legacy. Across the country, screens lit up with the footage. Cable news anchors replayed it on loop, their voices tinged with awe. Headlines blazed across every platform within the hour. Pelosi silenced. Judge Judy redefines power in 47 seconds. Clips went viral on every feed, captioned simply with 3 words: "She ended her." But the people who had followed Judy for decades saw something different. They saw not the destruction of Pelosi, but the restoration of Judy. They saw a woman who had been mocked, underestimated, and dismissed rise from her chair and remind the world that intellect doesn't shout and real strength doesn't flinch. For countless young women watching, it became more than entertainment. It became proof. Proof that you can be calm and still win. That you can be quiet and still shake the ground when you speak. That you don't need to roar to be heard. You just need to know the truth and carry it like fire. Pelosi's words would fade. Judy's moment would not. In law schools, professors began showing the clip in lectures about courtroom conduct. In corporate offices, women replayed it in break rooms, whispering, "That's how you do it." And in homes across America, daughters sat beside mothers watching it together, both silently absorbing what they saw, not just victory, but vindication. And somewhere in the quiet corner of her home, Judy likely sat down at her kitchen table, poured herself a cup of tea, and opened the newspaper like nothing remarkable had happened at all. Because to her, this wasn't victory. This was simply what happens when truth remembers its voice. Nancy Pelosi had tried to rewrite Judy's legacy with a single insult. Judy had responded with a single moment and written it in stone. That's why this won't just be remembered as a courtroom clash. It will be remembered as the day the world was reminded that some people don't need power to be powerful. They just need silence. And the right 47 seconds. If this moment reminded you why real respect still matters, subscribe now and comment "Power in Silence" to stand with Judge Judy and keep her legacy alive.